Number 15. Rodney Alcala, USA. Described as a handsome and charming man, Alcala claims to have killed over 30 women throughout Southern California, while he is suspected in several murders in New York, with a possible total of 130 murders across the US. Alcala would enchant women with his words and good looks, claiming to be a photographer and offering to kickstart a modeling career. After taking a few photos, he would attack and rape his victims before killing them. Even more disturbing is he was selected as a contestant on The Dating Game and won. Fortunately, the women found Alcala too creepy and refused to go out with him. By the time he was on the show, he was a convicted child molester and had been on his serial spree for several years. He was arrested in 1979 and found guilty in 3 separate trials in 1980, 1986 and 2010, all of which he received the death penalty. He is currently awaiting execution in San Quentin prison. Many of the women Alcala photographed are still unidentified, and police have posted the images online in hopes of setting closure for these unnamed victims. 14. Andrei Chikatilo, Soviet Union, Russia. Appropriately named the Butcher of Rostov, Chikatilo murdered 52 women and children, ranging in age from 7 to 45 between 1978 and 1990. He used his knowledge as a former schoolteacher to lure runaway children from rail stations into the wooded areas around Rostov, where he would rape and murder them. According to psychologists, he found murder sexually arousing and would only achieve orgasm while stabbing his victims. Chikatilo was able to evade capture for so long due to a mix of corruption and bureaucratic attempts to cover up the killings in order to maintain the myth of serial murder being solely a Western phenomenon. 2 innocent men were tried and executed for his crimes. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, Russian authorities sought help from the FBI and were able to capture Chikatilo after an extensive stakeout of railway stations around the Rostov region. He was convicted of all 52 murders and was executed by gunshot to the head in 1994. 13. Fred and Rose West, UK. This British couple from Gloucester murdered 11 girls and young women between 1967 and 1987, including a woman pregnant with Fred's child and Fred's stepdaughter from his previous marriage. Their basement was a makeshift torture chamber, earning the house the title House of Horrors. Fred would savagely torture and rape the victims, with full cooperation and participation from Rose. Most of the victims were kept alive for days and subjected to various amounts of abuse, too graphic to describe. The Wests were caught after Fred filmed himself raping his own daughter, and she told her friends at school what had happened. Although the investigation collapsed, the Wests found themselves on police radar, and a search warrant was obtained in 1994. Investigators uncovered the remains of several victims buried beneath the floorboards and the garden. Fred hanged himself in his cell during the trial, while Rose was given a life sentence without any possibility of release. The Wests' home on Cromwell Street was demolished in 1996 and is now a public walkway to the city centre. 12. Leonarda Cianciulli. Known as the soap maker of Correggio, Cianciulli murdered 3 women between 1939 and 1940 and used their bodies to make soap. Cianciulli had a chaotic upbringing, having been a result of her mother's rape, leading to an antagonism between the two. After Cianciulli's son was drafted into the Italian army on the prelude to the Second World War, she came to believe human sacrifices were required to ensure her son's safety. Along with the soap, Cianciulli would dry her victims' blood and mix it into flour, sugar and milk, which she and her son would consume. As for the bars of soap, she would give them as gifts to her neighbours. Cianciulli remarked on the last victim, "The cakes too were better. That woman was really sweet." An eyewitness eventually led police to Cianciulli, and she was sentenced to 30 years in prison. She died of a brain hemorrhage in 1970 while still serving her sentence. 11. Russell Williams, Canada. David Russell Williams was a highly respected colonel in the Canadian Air Force who commanded CFB Trenton. Behind the facade of military officer and husband, Williams held an overwhelming lust and would break into his neighbours' homes to steal female underwear. Once home with his stash, he would wear and take pictures of himself in the items he collected. After sexually assaulting 2 women, Williams upgraded to murder when he killed Corporal Marie-France Como, a military flight attendant who worked at Trenton in November 2009. He then kidnapped Jessica Lloyd in January 2010 and raped her several times over the course of a few days before she succumbed and died. However, Williams' luck ran out. His tyres were matched to tracks at Como's home and he was summoned for questioning by detectives. Williams was arrested on February 7, 2010 after he confessed to Ontario Provincial Police during a 10-hour interrogation. He's serving a life sentence in prison with no possibility of parole. 10. Robert Ben Rhodes, USA. Rhodes worked as a truck driver and delivered to various locations around the US. He had previously been a Marine, but was discharged after being arrested for robbery in the 1960s. Rhodes murdered 3 people between November 1989 and February 1990. His first 2 kills were newly married couple Candace Walsh and Doug Zaskowski, whom Rhodes picked up while they were hitchhiking. Zaskowski was first killed, while Walsh was kept alive as Rhodes tortured and raped her in a makeshift torture chamber he made in the back of his truck before strangling her to death. The third victim was 14-year-old Regina Walters, whom Rhodes picked up just outside of Chicago. He cut off most of Walters' hair, forced her to wear high heels and a black dress, then proceeded to take several photographs of her in an abandoned barn before murdering her. Rhodes was arrested in Arizona after officers discovered his 4th victim still alive in the trailer. He stood trial in Illinois for the murder of Regina Walters and pleaded guilty to first-degree murder. The most haunting item of the case is an image of Walters in the black dress and high heels, facing her attacker with a look of fear on her face. 9. Pedro Alonso Lopez, Colombia. Appropriately named the Monster of the Andes, Lopez is suspected for the murder of over 300 girls throughout Peru and Colombia. The son of a prostitute, Lopez was kicked out by his mother at age 8, and he learned to fend for himself. Leading a life of car theft during his teens, Lopez began to lure girls into abandoned buildings or wooded areas in his adulthood, where he would rape and kill them through various forms, mostly strangulation. He claimed his reason was due to him being a victim of rape and his desire to do the same to as many young girls as possible. Lopez was captured when market vendors saw him attempt to abduct another girl, and they intervened. At first, police refused to believe his claimed kill count until a flash flood washed up one of the mass graves. Later, he led police to a mass grave, revealing 81 bodies. He spent 18 years in an Ecuadorian prison before being released and deported back to Colombia, only to be rearrested by police and sent to prison until 1998. As of 2002, he has been placed on Interpol's most wanted list for suspicion of further murders, though his current whereabouts, or whether he is still alive, is unknown. 8. Dennis Nilsen, UK. Described as Britain's Jeffrey Dahmer, Nilsen murdered 15 homosexual men by strangulation or drowning in his Muswell Hill home in London between 1978 and 1983. He would bathe, dress, and keep the bodies for extended periods of time before dissecting and disposing of them via burning or flushing the remains down the toilet. Nilsen developed his twisted sexual fantasy based on the Theodore Jericho painting Raft of Medusa, where an old man is depicted holding the deceased body of a young, nude man on the bottom left of the haunting image. His fantasies included domination of a young, frail corpse by an older man such as himself. His murders came to light when city workers discovered human flesh in his sewage and notified authorities. When asked if he felt remorse for his killings, Nilsen replied, "I wished I could stop, but I couldn't. I had no other thrill or happiness." He was charged with 6 counts of murder and 1 count of attempted murder, sentencing him 25 to life in prison. 7. Luka Magnotta, Canada. An aspiring model from Ontario, Magnotta was described as an intense, if shy person, making money as a male escort in Montreal. He was obsessed with self-image and was known to frequently pay for plastic surgery in order to increase his beauty. Deep down, nothing was beautiful though, and he made national headlines when a severed foot arrived in the mail to Conservative Party headquarters in Ottawa, while a second package addressed to Liberal Party HQ was intercepted by police, revealing a severed hand. The hand and foot were quickly linked to a dismembered torso found in a suitcase outside Magnotta's apartment. Soon after, a video surfaced online titled "One Man, One Pickaxe," which is claimed to be the video of Magnotta murdering Chinese exchange student Lin Jun, who was revealed to be the victim discovered in the alley. Magnotta fled Canada and hid in Germany until he was recognized at an internet cafe and reported to German police. When he was caught, He was reading news articles about the murders, relishing in his twisted claim to fame. He was extradited back to Canada, where he received a life sentence in December 2014. 6. Allan Legere, Canada. Given the sinister name, the Monster of Miramachi, Legere led an extensive criminal record before graduating to serial murder in the late 1980s. While serving a life sentence for a previous murder, he escaped from a prison hospital and went on a murder spree in the area surrounding the Miramachi River of New Brunswick. Legere would break into homes at night, rape the owners, then beat them to death before burning the home down. Several of his victims were beaten so severely they choked to death on their own vomit. During his 7-month murder spree, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police launched one of the largest manhunts in Canadian history, but seemed helpless to catch the crazed man. Eventually, Legere was captured in November 1989 after a police pursuit when he attempted to reach a nearby airport. He claimed he was going to steal a plane and fly to Iran, though he has never explained why. Legere received another life sentence without parole and is currently serving his sentence in a maximum security prison. 5. Larry Bittaker and Roy Norris, USA. Collectively known as the Toolbox Killers, Bittaker and Norris preyed on young women throughout California over a 5-month period in 1979. The two would kidnap their victims, drive to a secluded area, then proceed to rape and torture them using an array of tools they kept with them before ultimately killing them. John Douglas, one of the first FBI criminal profilers, described Bittaker as the most disturbing person he'd ever profiled. 2 of the victims, aged 13 and 15, were held captive for 2 days and were forced to pose for pornographic photos, along with being subjected to gruesome tortures before finally being killed. Their murder spree was thankfully cut short when Norris confided in a colleague, Jimmy Dalton, about the murders, and Dalton contacted authorities. After a surveillance investigation, Norris and Bittaker were arrested for dealing and possession of marijuana. While in custody, Norris agreed to confess and testify against Bittaker in exchange for a lighter sentence. Norris received a life sentence, while Bittaker is currently awaiting execution. 4. Henri Landru, France. Nicknamed the real-life Bluebird, Landru would lure widows into his home via personal ads in newspapers and murder them, then burn their bodies in his own oven to hide evidence. His murders lasted between 1914 and 1919 during World War I, thus granting him many potential victims as husbands would die on the battlefield. He murdered 11 people before being captured in 1919 after the sister of one of his victims identified Landru as the last person her sister was seen with. On top of the 10 women he killed, he also killed the adolescent son of one victim. During his trial, Landru sketched a picture of his kitchen, and after it was released in 1967, writing on the back stated, "It is not the wall behind which things take place, but indeed the stove in which a thing has been burned." He was executed by guillotine in 1922, and his head is currently on display in the Museum of Death in Hollywood, California. 3. Katherine Knight, Australia. A violent woman throughout her life, Knight held knowledge of meat preparation from her time working in a butcher shop. Acquaintances and family described her as a quick-tempered individual who would fly into murderous rages over mild circumstances. Knight's first 3 marriages collapsed due to her violent nature, but she later married John Price. However, things soured and Price kicked her out and filed a restraining order as he couldn't handle her abusive nature. After apparently reconciling, Knight was allowed back into the home by Price, and after he fell asleep, Knight stabbed him 37 times, then skinned him, beheaded him, and removed chunks of meat from his body. Police were notified when Price didn't arrive for work, and upon searching his home, found the grisly scene. Furthermore, Price's head was found boiling in a pot, and parts of his buttocks were frying on the stove. Knight was arrested, and she admitted she was planning to feed Price to Price's children. She received a life sentence, her file stating in big, bold letters, "Never to be released." 2. Luis Garavito. Also known as La Bestia, Garavito is considered the most prolific serial killer of all time. Garavito targeted children and gained their trust by offering jobs and sweets. Once alone with the children, he would tie them up, rape, and eventually kill them via slicing their throat or decapitation. When he was captured in 1999, he admitted to 140 murders and has since accurately led investigators to over 170 makeshift graves of his victims. He is currently awaiting conviction for 138 murders, which would normally add up to a total of 1,853 years in prison. Sadly, Colombian law limits sentences to 30 years in prison, and his sentence has been reduced to 22 years because he helped lead authorities to the bodies and has been cooperative throughout the investigation. 1. Nikolai Dzhumagaliev, Kazakh SSR. A true Hannibal Lecter, Dzhumagaliev killed 9 women and cannibalized them during a one-year spree in 1979 and 1980. Friends affectionately called him Metal Fang due to his teeth being literally made of white metal. Dzhumagaliev claims to have killed and eaten between 50 and 100 people and served human flesh to unsuspecting friends and relatives. He was caught after he invited several friends over, murdered one guest, and proceeded to dismember him in the adjacent room. Unsurprisingly, he was caught and the guests fled in terror. Police found Dzhumagaliev kneeling in his home, covered in blood. In their shock, Dzhumagaliev escaped naked into the woods with only a hatchet, though he was captured the next morning. Sentenced to a mental institution, he escaped once, but was quickly recaptured. After spending 10 years institutionalized, he was declared cured despite protests from the police colonel and released. His whereabouts aren't known, though he is suspected to be living with his family in Eastern Europe.
Got an idea for a top 15 list? Be sure to leave it in the comments below. Be sure to subscribe for future videos. Thanks for watching.